The galaxy finally understood why predators give their young to humans. Part 4. The truth emerges. The human vessel Endurance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Threkan territory. Commander Lisa Chun stood on the bridge and studied the star charts with careful attention. No human ship had ever traveled this deep into Predator space. Every safety protocol screamed that this was a mistake. But Lisa had served with Daniel for 15 years, and she trusted his judgment more than any protocol. Daniel stood beside her with Kira at his side. They watched through the forward view screen as 3 Threkan warships approached to escort them deeper into the system. The ships were massive and deadly, but they held formation peacefully. This was the first time in galactic history that Threkan vessels had protected a non-Threkan ship rather than hunting it. The journey to Karvas took 6 hours. Daniel spent the time reviewing everything they knew about the plague and its origins. The evidence pointed to a conspiracy years in the making. Someone had stolen genetic samples from a neutral research station. Someone had developed a targeted bioweapon. Someone had released it on Threkan, worlds knowing it would kill millions. The only question was who. Karvas appeared on the view screen like a wound in space. The planet was dark and scarred, its atmosphere heavy with smoke from fires that still burned in abandoned cities. Varax had warned them about what they would find, but the reality was worse than any warning could convey. The shuttle descended through clouds of ash. Daniel looked out the window and saw civilization dying. Empty streets stretched between massive buildings that had been designed for creatures 3 times human size. Mass graves dotted the landscape, marked by Threkan symbols of mourning. Occasionally, they passed a settlement that still showed signs of life, but even these seemed hollow, populated by too few adults and too many cubs huddled together for warmth and safety. Vorax met them at the landing site. The elder moved more slowly than Daniel remembered, and his scales had faded to a dull gray. The plague had not killed him, but the weight of watching his species die was taking its own toll. He welcomed them to Karvas and thanked them for coming. His voice carried a formality that Daniel now understood was Threkan custom during times of grief. Everything about this visit was wrapped in ritual and tradition, because ritual was all that held the survivors together. Varax led them through the empty streets to a facility that had once been a research center. Inside, Threkan scientists worked alongside equipment that looked ancient and poorly maintained. They were doing everything they could to understand the plague, but resources were scarce and time was running out. The head scientist was a female Threkan named Sarix. She explained their findings in clinical terms that could not hide the horror beneath. The plague had been engineered using techniques that only 3 species possessed. 2 of those species had no motive. The third was the Veluxi. Daniel asked about proof. Sarek showed them the genetic markers embedded in the plague's structure. These markers were like fingerprints, unique to the laboratory where the weapon had been created. The laboratory was located on a station called Research Point Gamma, officially a neutral facility, but secretly funded by elements within the Veluxi. Government. The problem was that genetic markers alone would not convince the Council. They needed records, communications, physical evidence. They needed someone to testify about what had happened. And that evidence existed only on Research Point Gamma itself. Kira studied the data with growing certainty. She said they could do this. If they could reach the station, she could find the proof. She had worked in similar facilities before. She knew what to look for. Lisa warned that Research Point Gamma was deep in neutral space, surrounded by Veluxi patrol ships. Getting there would be almost impossible. Getting out would be worse. Rax said he would come with them. His presence would draw attention away from the Endurance. Threkan ships appearing in neutral space would cause enough chaos to create an opportunity. Daniel did not want to accept this sacrifice. He told Varax that the risk was too great. If anything happened to the Elder, The Threkin people would lose one of their last leaders. Varax placed one massive clawed hand on Daniel's shoulder. He said that the Threkin people had already lost everything that mattered. Cubs were dying every day. His own grandchildren had perished in the plague's first wave. He had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by helping humans expose the truth. They left. Carvos the next morning. The journey to Research Point Gamma took 3 days. They traveled through shipping lanes and avoided patrol routes, using Threkin intelligence to guide them around the heaviest concentrations of Veluxy vessels. Varax proved invaluable, his knowledge of galactic politics and hidden pathways keeping them one step ahead of detection. They reached the station at night, or what passed for night in the darkness of space. Research Point Gamma was a small facility orbiting an unremarkable moon, designed to look insignificant. Only a few ships were docked nearby, and scanners showed minimal security presence. Daniel, Kira, and Varax took a shuttle to the station while Lisa kept the Endurance hidden behind the moon. They docked without incident and made their way through empty corridors toward the central database. The station felt abandoned, staffed by a skeleton crew that seemed more interested in their own research than security. Kira found the records within an hour. Communications between station administrators and Veluxy officials. Financial transfers from hidden accounts. Research logs detailing the development and testing of the plague. Everything they needed to prove that the Threkin genocide had been planned and executed with cold deliberation. She copied everything to a secure drive and signaled Daniel that they were done. That was when the Veluxy strike team attacked. They came through the walls, cutting through metal with plasma torches and firing weapons that filled the corridors with deadly light. Daniel grabbed Kira and ran while Varax turned to face their attackers. The Threkin elder was old, but he was still a predator, and he fought with a fury that Daniel had never witnessed. They made it back to the shuttle. Daniel looked back and saw Varax surrounded by Veluxy soldiers, his scales scorched and bleeding from a dozen wounds. The elder met Daniel's eyes and shouted a single word in Threkin. Go. Daniel hesitated for one terrible moment. Then he sealed the shuttle door and launched. Varax fell beneath the Veluxy assault as the shuttle pulled away. Daniel watched through the rear camera, his heart breaking, until the station disappeared from view. They reached the Endurance minutes before the Veluxy fleet arrived. Lisa had the ship moving before they even docked, pushing the engines past safety limits to escape the system. Behind them, weapons fire lit up the darkness, but they were already gone, jumping to hyperspace with the evidence that could change everything. Kira sat in silence, the data drive clutched in her hands. Daniel stood at the viewport and thought about Varax, about his sacrifice, about the reason he had given it. The elder had believed that humans could save his people. He had believed it enough to die for it. Daniel would not let that belief be wasted. He would reach the council. He would show them the truth. He would honor Varax's sacrifice by giving the Threkin cubs a future worth living. The Endurance raced toward home, carrying hope and a small data drive and grief in the hearts of everyone aboard. The galaxy finally understood why predators give their young to humans. Part 5. A new understanding. The Endurance emerged from hyperspace with 3 Veluxy warships on its tail. Commander Lisa Chun pushed the engines harder than they were ever designed to run, burning through fuel reserves and praying the ship would hold together long enough to reach council space. Behind her, Daniel watched the pursuing vessels with grim determination. They had come too far to fail now. The communications array crackled with threats and demands. The Veluxy ships ordered them to surrender the stolen data. They promised safe passage if Daniel handed over the evidence. They threatened destruction if he refused. Daniel did not respond. He knew their promises were worthless. Anyone who would engineer a plague to kill millions would not hesitate to destroy one small human ship to hide the truth. They crossed into Council space with the Veluxi still pursuing. Lisa sent emergency broadcasts on every frequency, calling for assistance, announcing that they carried evidence of genocide. Within minutes, ships from a dozen species converged on their position. The Veluxi warships slowed and then stopped, unwilling to attack with so many witnesses present. On New Montana, the colonists watched the broadcast with held breath. Beth stood in the town square surrounded by her people, her hand gripping her daughter's shoulder. The Threcken facility was locked down, protected by Carlos and every volunteer who had refused to abandon the cubs they had come to love. Rask, Nira, and Ven huddled together in the common room, sensing the tension around them without understanding its source. Molly sat with them, telling stories about Earth animals, trying to keep them calm while the adults dealt with whatever crisis was unfolding. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Every species sent representatives. The chamber was packed beyond capacity, with crowds gathered outside watching on screens. This was the most important moment in galactic politics since the Threcken Wars. Daniel walked to the central platform, with Kira beside him. He looked exhausted, his clothes still stained with ash from Carvos and soot from their escape. But his voice was steady when he began to speak. He told them everything. He described the dying world of Carvos and the mass graves that stretched to the horizon. He described the orphan cubs crying for parents who would never return. He described the evidence they had found on Research Point Gamma, the communications and financial records and research logs that proved the plague was not a natural disaster. Then he told them about Varax. He described the Elder Sacrifice, how he had stayed behind to face the Veluxi strike team so that Daniel and Kira could escape with the truth. He described the last word Varax had spoken, the command to go, the final act of a leader who loved his people enough to die for their future. The chamber was silent when Daniel finished. Then Kira stepped forward and presented the evidence. The data was irrefutable. Communications showed Veluxi officials authorizing funding for the bioweapon project. Financial records traced payments from hidden government accounts to researchers at the station. Research logs detailed the development process with horrifying precision, including test results from unauthorized trials on captured Threcken prisoners. High Counselor Preet rose from his seat. His compound eyes were unreadable, his mandibles clicking softly in what might have been distress or anger. He demanded time to verify the evidence. He claimed it could be fabricated. Senator Grace Mitchell stood and called for an immediate council vote on verification procedures. The motion passed overwhelmingly. Independent experts from neutral species were appointed to review the data. The verification took 3 hours. When the experts delivered their conclusion, Preet's objections died in his throat. The evidence was authentic. The plague had been engineered by elements within the Veluxi government. Genocide had been committed in the name of Veluxi security. The chamber erupted into chaos. Species that had supported the Veluxi coalition withdrew their backing. Old alliances crumbled. High Counselor Preet stood alone at his station, facing the judgment of the galaxy. Ambassador Yenix approached the central platform. She was the same Veluxi who had described losing her family to Threcken raids. She had every reason to hate the predators who had caused her so much pain. But she looked at the evidence, and she looked at the images of dying cubs, and something in her compound eye shifted. She spoke slowly, each word measured. She said that her people had suffered greatly at Threcken claws. She said that fear had driven them to terrible choices. She said that what had been done was wrong, and that she could not defend it regardless of the historical crimes that had motivated it. Then she turned to Preet and demanded his resignation. The High Counselor tried to argue. He claimed ignorance of the conspiracy. He insisted that he had never authorized genocide. But the evidence showed that he had known, that he had deliberately looked the other way while his subordinates murdered millions. The The council voted to remove him from office. The Luxy security forces were ordered to arrest the officials responsible. The faction that had engineered the plague was dismantled within days. On New Montana, the colonists celebrated. Carlos stood at the window of the Threcken facility and watched the sun set over the mountains. Behind him, Ven was teaching Molly how to make the Threcken clicking sound that meant happiness. Rosk was drawing again, his artwork now including human figures alongside Threcken ones. Nera was explaining human technology to a group of younger colony children, her forearms gesturing enthusiastically. When Daniel finally returned home, he found a changed world waiting for him. The cubs rushed to greet him, having learned from their caretakers that this human had traveled across the galaxy to save their people. Ven wrapped all four arms around Daniel's waist and made a sound that Kira translated as gratitude beyond words. Daniel knelt and hugged the cub back. He thought about Varax and the sacrifice the elder had made. He hoped that somehow Varax knew what his sacrifice had achieved. In the months that followed, humanity launched the largest relief effort in galactic history. Thousands of volunteers traveled to Threcken worlds to help care for orphaned cubs. Human families across 100 colonies opened their homes to children who had lost everything. The bonds formed on New Montana became a model for interspecies cooperation that had never existed before. 5 years passed. Daniel stood on the observation deck of Harmony 7 and watched as a new delegation arrived. The ships were not Threcken. They belonged to the Vraken, another predator species that had watched humanity's work with growing interest. Behind them came vessels from the Korath and the Seathrix, predator cultures that had been isolated from galactic society for centuries. They all came with the same request. They had orphaned young who needed care. They had seen what humans could do. They wanted to give their children the same chance the Threckens had received. Kira stood beside Daniel, now serving as the head of the new Interspecies Child Welfare Agency. She reviewed the delegation's requests and began planning how to help them. Below them, in the station's public plaza, a young Threcken woman was giving a speech to an assembled crowd. Her name was Nera, and she had grown tall and confident in the years since her arrival on New Montana. She spoke about cooperation between species, about breaking cycles of fear and violence, about the family she had found among humans who saw her as a child rather than a monster. Beside her stood Rosk, his artwork now displayed in galleries across the galaxy, creating images that bridged the gap between predator and prey. And Carlos stood proudly nearby, officially retired, but still keeping watch over the children he had once feared and now loved as his own. A galactic news broadcast captured the moment. The commentator, a Veluxy journalist who had once demanded humans abandon the cubs, offered a simple observation that would be quoted for generations to come. She said that the galaxy had finally understood why predators give their young to humans. Not because humans were stronger or smarter or more advanced. Not because they had the best technology or the largest military. But because humans were the only species that looked at a predator's child and saw not a threat to be eliminated, but a life to be nurtured. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. That was why the predators trusted them with their most precious treasure. And that was why the future would be different than the past. Daniel smiled and turned back to his work. There were more children who needed help, more bridges to build, more proof that compassion could triumph over fear. The galaxy was finally learning what humanity had always known. Every child deserved a chance. Every life had value. And love was stronger than any instinct, any history, any wall that fear could build. The work was just beginning. The galaxy finally understood why predators give their young to humans. Part 3. The opposition. The broadcast spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Someone had leaked footage from New Montana showing human children playing with Threcken cubs. The images were everywhere within hours. They showed Molly teaching Nira to throw a ball. They showed Rosk presenting his artwork to a crowd of admiring colonists. They showed Ven napping peacefully with his head in Carlos's lap while the former soldier read reports on his tablet. Half the galaxy responded with wonder. The other half responded with rage. High Counselor Preet of the Veloxy called an emergency session of the Galactic Council. His species resembled giant insects with compound eyes and clicking mandibles, and their history with the Threkins was written in blood. 300 years ago, the Threkins had hunted the Veloxy across 4 star systems. Billions had died. The trauma had become part of Veloxy culture, passed down through generations as a warning. Everything about predators and the danger they represented. Preet stood before the assembled council and demanded that humanity cease all contact with Threkin Young immediately. His voice clicked and buzzed with barely controlled emotion as he spoke. He said that humans were being foolish. He said the Threkins were manipulating them. He said that raising Predator Young would create a generation of monsters who would one day turn on their human caretakers and then on the rest of the galaxy. Ambassador Yenix spoke next. She was older than Preet. Her chitin faded with age, and her compound eyes had seen horrors that younger Veloxy could only imagine. She described watching her family die during the Threkin raids. She described the fear that still gripped her when she saw those black ships. She asked how humans could betray the memory of all the prey species who had suffered. Senator Grace Mitchell represented humanity at the session. She listened to every accusation with patience and then rose to respond. She acknowledged the terrible history between Threkins and other species. She expressed genuine sympathy for the trauma the Veloxy had experienced. But she argued that the children they were raising had committed no crimes. These cubs were orphans, not warriors. They had never hunted anyone. They deserved a chance to grow up differently than their ancestors. The council chamber erupted into shouting. Species that had remained neutral began taking sides. Old alliances shifted. Old wounds reopened. On New Montana, the colonists watched the broadcast with growing anxiety. Beth called a town meeting to address concerns. She stood before her people and asked for continued support. She reminded them that Rosk, Nira, and Ven were children who had done nothing wrong. She asked if New Montana was the kind of place that abandoned children because of politics. Most of the colonists agreed with her. But not all. 2 nights later, someone tried to burn down the Threkin facility. Carlos had established security protocols weeks ago, so the fire was detected quickly and extinguished before it caused serious damage. But the message was clear. Not everyone wanted the cubs here. Not everyone believed they deserved protection. The cubs sensed the tension. Their behavior regressed. Rask stopped drawing and started hiding. Nira became aggressive again, snapping at caretakers who approached too quickly. Ven clung to Carlos constantly, trembling at any loud noise. Kira documented everything with growing concern. She told Daniel that the cubs were resilient but not unbreakable. Continued stress could cause permanent psychological damage. They needed stability and safety, and right now they had neither. Then she discovered something that changed everything. While reviewing medical data from Threkin sources, she noticed an anomaly in the plague's genetic signature. Biological weapons left traces that natural diseases did not. Kira was not a weapons expert, but she knew enough to recognize the signs. She showed her findings to Daniel and watched his face go pale. The plague had not occurred naturally. Someone had engineered it. Daniel contacted Varax through secure channels and shared Kira's discovery. The Threkin elder was silent for a long time. When he finally responded, his voice was heavy with a terrible weariness. He said that Threkin scientists had reached the same conclusion weeks ago. They had been searching for proof ever since. The trail led to a neutral research station where genetic samples had been stolen years before. The thieves had covered their tracks well, but not well enough. Daniel asked who was responsible. Varax said they believed it was a faction within the Veluxi government. Not High Counselor Preet himself, but people who operated in the shadows with his implicit approval. People who had decided that the only way to guarantee Veluxi safety was to eliminate the Threkan threat entirely. Daniel felt sick. He asked if Varax could prove this. Varax said the evidence existed, but it was fragmented and scattered across multiple systems. Gathering it would require traveling to Threkan space, which no non-Threkan had ever done. It would be dangerous. It might be impossible, but it was the only way to expose the truth and stop the Veluxi coalition from destroying everything humans had built with the Cubs. Daniel knew what he had to do. He contacted Grace and told her he needed authorization for an unprecedented diplomatic mission. He was going to the Threkan homeworld. Grace warned him that the Council would never approve this. The Veluxi would see it as a provocation. Earth might face sanctions or worse. Daniel said he understood the risks. But somewhere out there, children were dying because someone had decided to commit genocide. He could not stand by and let that continue. He would not. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she would buy him as much time as she could. She told him to find the foof and bring it back. She told him to be careful. Before Daniel left, he visited the Threkan facility one last time. The Cubs were in the common area with their caretakers. Rosk looked up when Daniel entered and made the clicking sound that meant happiness. Nira waved with 2 of her 4 arms. Ven was asleep against Carlos's side, finally peaceful. Carlos met Daniel's eyes and nodded slowly. He did not need to speak. They both understood what was at stake. These children had become part of New Montana. They had become part of Carlos's life in ways he never expected. He would protect them while Daniel was gone, no matter what came. Daniel knelt beside the sleeping Ven and gently touched the cub's scaled head. He made a silent promise that he would find the truth. He would expose whoever had tried to destroy these children's entire species. He would give them a future worth living. Then he rose and walked toward the shuttle that would take him to the stars, toward the Threkan homeworld that no human had ever seen, toward answers that could change the galaxy forever. Behind him, 3 orphan cubs continued to play with their human friends, unaware that their survival now depended on one man's courage and the bonds that had formed between predators and the strange species that refused to fear them. The galaxy finally understood why predators give their young to humans. Part 2. Understanding the Predator, the transport ship landed on New Montana under a pale blue sky. Daniel stood at the edge of the landing pad with Kira beside him and watched the cargo ramp lower slowly. Behind them, a crowd of colonists had gathered despite the security warnings. Everyone wanted to see the impossible with their own eyes. 3 Threkan cubs walked down the ramp. They were smaller than Daniel had expected. The tallest one barely reached his chest. Their scales were softer than adult Threkans, more gray than black, and their golden eyes were wide with fear. They huddled together at the bottom of the ramp, 4 small arms each wrapped around each other, claws retracted and bodies trembling. Beth Palmer, the colony administrator, stepped forward slowly. She was a practical woman in her 50s who had built this colony from nothing. She had agreed to host the cubs despite protests from half her population. Now she looked at these frightened children and her expression softened. She said their names quietly: Rosk, Nira, Ven. She had memorized them from the files. She welcomed them to New Montana and told them they were safe here. The cubs did not respond. They pressed closer together and made a low keening sound that hurt Daniel's heart to hear. Sergeant Carlos Vega stood nearby with his security team. He was a former military officer, scarred from battles that Daniel did not know about, and his hand rested on his weapon as he watched the cubs. He had argued against this arrangement from the beginning. He said it was too dangerous. He said these were predators, not children, and that everyone would regret this decision. The first week proved him partially right. The cubs were housed in a specially designed facility on the edge of town. It had been built quickly using specifications from Threkan scientists, with temperature controls, appropriate lighting, and spaces designed for climbing and hiding. The caretakers were volunteers who had passed psychological evaluations and received basic training in Threkan biology. None of it mattered. The cubs refused to eat. They attacked anyone who came too close. Rosk bit a caretaker badly enough to require emergency surgery. Nira destroyed her room twice in what seemed like fits of rage. Ven simply stopped moving entirely, curling into a ball in the corner and refusing to respond to anything. Kira worked around the clock trying to understand what was going wrong. She reviewed the data obsessively, cross-referencing Threkan development patterns with the cub's behavior. On the fifth day, she finally found the answer. She called Daniel and Beth to her lab and showed them her findings. Threkan cubs, she explained, had evolved to interpret fear as a threat signal. When prey species showed fear around them, their instincts told them they were in danger. The cubs were not attacking because they were aggressive. They were attacking because they were terrified. Every caretaker who approached them with even a trace of nervousness was triggering their defensive responses. Beth asked what they were supposed to do. No one could approach a Threkan cub without feeling at least some fear. It was hardwired into the brain of every intelligent species. Kira said that was not entirely true. Humans had an unusual response to predators. Unlike true prey species, humans did not always default to fear. Some humans responded with curiosity, or calm assessment, or even excitement. If they could find people who genuinely felt no fear around the cubs, they might be able to break through. The answer came from an unexpected source. Beth's daughter. Molly was 8 years old, with red hair and a complete inability to follow rules. She had been told repeatedly to stay away from the Threkan facility. She had listened to these instructions and then ignored them entirely. The security feed showed her slipping through a gap in the fence that no one had noticed. She walked straight into the facility through a door that someone had left unlocked. She found her way to the common area where all 3 cubs had been gathered for another failed feeding attempt. Carlos saw the footage first and sprinted toward the facility with his weapon drawn. Daniel and Beth were right behind him. They expected to find a tragedy. Instead, they found Molly sitting on the floor with all 3 cubs gathered around her. She was showing them her tablet, swiping through pictures of animals from Earth. The cubs were watching with intense focus. Nira had her head tilted to the side, her golden eyes tracking each image. Rosk was making a soft clicking sound that Kira later identified as Threkan laughter. Ven had uncurled from his protective ball and was pressing close to Molly's side. Molly looked up when the adults burst in. She asked if she was in trouble. Beth did not know whether to hug her daughter or ground her for the rest of her natural life. She settled for pulling Molly close and checking her for injuries. There were none. The cubs had not hurt her at all. Carlos lowered his weapon slowly. His face showed confusion and something else. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Kira knelt down and studied the scene with scientific fascination. She asked Molly how she felt around the cubs. Molly shrugged and said they were cute. She said they looked scared, and she felt bad for them. She wanted to show them that Earth had cool animals too. There was no fear in her voice, no trace of nervousness. She genuinely saw these predator children as nothing more than scared kids who needed a friend. Over the following weeks, they rebuilt their entire approach around this discovery. They recruited caretakers based on psychological profiles that prioritized genuine fearlessness over training. They brought in children from the colony to interact with the cubs under careful supervision. They stopped treating the Threkins as dangerous animals and started treating them as traumatized kids. The results were dramatic. Rosk began to eat again. He also began to draw, filling pages with strange angular artwork that combined Threkin symbols with images from his new home. Nira developed an obsession with human technology and spent hours watching colonists repair equipment. Ven, the most withdrawn of the three, formed an unexpected bond with Carlos. The gruff security chief had approached the cub one day without fear because he simply did not feel fear anymore, not after everything he had survived. Ven had sensed this and responded to it. Daniel watched these changes with growing hope. He sent regular reports back to Earth and to Varax. The Threkin elder responded with messages that conveyed relief and gratitude in the formal Threkin way. Then Varax sent a new message that changed everything. The plague had continued to spread. The situation on Threkin worlds had grown worse. There were now over 2,000 orphan cubs, and the number grew every day. The few Threkins who could care for young were overwhelmed. Cubs were dying from neglect, from grief, from the psychological damage of losing their parents and having no one to imprint upon. Varax asked if humanity could do more. Daniel read the message 3 times. He thought about Rosk laughing at Molly's animal pictures. He thought about Nira's eyes lighting up when she learned something new. He thought about Ven following Carlos around the facility like a shadow. He thought about 2,000 more cubs who could have the same chance if humanity was brave enough to offer it. He began writing a proposal that would change human history. He did not know yet how much opposition he would face or what it would cost to see this through. He only knew that somewhere in the galaxy, children were dying, and he had the power to help them. That was enough. That had always been enough for humanity. The galaxy finally understood why predators give their young to humans. Part 1. The impossible request. The alarm started screaming across Galactic Council Station Harmony 7 at exactly midday. Daniel Porter looked up from his morning coffee and watched through the observation window as 3 massive warships dropped out of hyperspace. The ships were black as death itself, covered in sharp angles and weapons that could crack a planet in half. Every diplomat in the station knew those ships. Every child in the galaxy had nightmares about them. The Threkins had arrived. Within minutes, the station descended into chaos. Prey species stampeded toward escape pods. The Veluxi delegation sealed themselves inside their quarters and refused to open the doors. Even the Korath, who stood 9 feet tall and feared nothing, moved to the far side of the station. Daniel watched all of this with quiet interest. He had been humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 7 years, and he had learned that panic rarely helped anyone. His communicator buzzed. It was Kira Lawson, the station's human xenobiologist. Her voice was steady but curious. She asked if he had seen the ships. Daniel told her he had. She told him something strange was happening. The Threkins had requested a meeting, and they had asked for humans specifically. Daniel made his way to the main diplomatic hall. The corridors were empty now. Everyone had hidden themselves away from the predators who had once hunted intelligent species for sport. The Threkins had joined the Galactic Council 200 years ago after a war that had cost billions of lives. They had agreed to peace, but no one had forgotten what they were capable of. The diplomatic hall was a vast circular room with seats arranged in tiers around a central platform. Today, only the human delegation was present. Daniel took his position and waited. Kira joined him, her tablet ready to record everything. The doors opened, and the Threkins entered. Daniel had seen images of them before, but nothing prepared him for the reality. The leader stood 8 feet tall, his body covered in scales that shifted color with each movement. 4 arms ended in claws that could tear through metal. His eyes were golden and slitted, and when he moved, Every motion spoke of barely controlled power. Behind him came 4 more Threkins, each one equally terrifying. The leader stopped before the human delegation and spoke. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. He introduced himself as Varax, elder of the Threkin High Council. He said he had come to make a request of humanity. Daniel stood and offered a formal greeting. He asked what the Threkins wanted. Varax was silent for a long moment. Then he did something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. The massive predator lowered himself to one knee and bowed his head. His voice, when he spoke again, was heavy with something Daniel had never expected to hear from a Threkin. It was desperation. Varax explained that a plague had swept through Threkin space. It had killed millions of adults, particularly those who carried the genetic markers for child-rearing instincts. Threkin society was complex. Not every adult could raise young. It required specific biological and psychological traits that the plague had targeted with terrible precision. Now there were thousands of orphan cubs across their worlds, and the surviving adults did not know how to care for them. The cubs were dying. Kira leaned forward and asked why the Threkins had come to humans. There were hundreds of species in the galaxy. Why not ask any of them? Varax raised his head and looked directly at her. He said they had tried. Every species they approached had refused. The prey species were too afraid. The other predator species lacked the patience and gentleness that young Threkins required. Threkin cubs were sensitive creatures despite their fearsome appearance. They needed emotional bonds, careful attention, and above all, they needed caretakers who would not fear them. Daniel asked why Threkins thought humans would be different. Varax stood and walked closer. His massive form towered over Daniel, but the human did not step back. Varax noticed this, and something like approval flickered in his golden eyes. He said that Threkins had been watching humanity for 50 years. They had seen human soldiers adopt children from enemy nations after wars. They had seen humans take in the young of other species, even dangerous ones, and raise them with love. They had seen humans face predators without the fear response that other species showed. Humans were not prey, Varax said. But they were not typical predators either. They were something else entirely. Something the Threkins did not fully understand but desperately needed. The request hung in the air between them. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He asked for time to consult with Earth's government. Varax agreed and said he would wait, but he warned that every day of delay meant more cubs would die after the Threkins left. Kira turned to Daniel with wide eyes. She said this was unprecedented. No predator species had ever trusted another species with their young. It went against every instinct, every evolutionary drive. For the Threkins to make this request meant they were truly desperate. Daniel contacted Senator Grace Mitchell on Earth. Her response was immediate and concerned. She said the Council was already pressuring Earth to refuse. The Veluxi were threatening consequences if humans agreed. The political situation was dangerous. Daniel asked her what she wanted him to do. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him what his gut told him. Daniel thought about Varax kneeling before them. He thought about the desperation in those golden eyes. He thought about cubs dying alone because no one in the galaxy would help them. He told Grace that his gut told him these were children who needed help. Everything else was politics. Grace sighed and said she would handle the Council. She told Daniel to learn everything he could about Threkin young before they made their final decision. Over the next 3 days, Kira worked without sleep. She studied every piece of information available about Threkin biology and development. She discovered that Threkin cubs imprinted on their caretakers within the first year of life. Without that bond, they became aggressive and unstable. They needed touch, attention, and emotional connection. They needed to feel safe. On the 4th day, A classified file arrived from an anonymous source. Daniel read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. The file contained observation reports going back decades. The Threkins had not chosen humanity randomly. They had been studying humans specifically, compiling data on how humans raised young, how they responded to danger, how they formed emotional bonds across species lines. The Threkins had been planning this for years. They had known something like this might happen, and they had already decided that if it did, humans were the only species they would trust. Daniel called Varax and asked for a meeting. When the Threkin elder arrived, Daniel showed him the file and asked if it was genuine. Varax confirmed that it was. He said the Threkins had learned long ago that preparation was the key to survival. They had prepared for many possible futures, and in every scenario where their young needed outside help, humans were the only acceptable choice. Daniel asked why. Varax looked at him with those ancient golden eyes and said something that would change the course of galactic history. Because, he said, humans look at a predator's child and see only a child. You are the only species in the galaxy that does this. You are the only ones who can save our future. Daniel knew then what his answer would be. He just had to convince the rest of humanity that raising the children of the galaxy's most feared predators was the right thing to do.